The movie When Harry Met Sally is famous for one scene, and basically one scene only. Can't tell you what the rest of the movie is about, except for that cafe scene with Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan. I'm not going to describe the scene. It's full of sexual innuendo, but it ends with perhaps the most famous line ever uttered by a movie extra, which is, "I'll have what she's having." And that same sentiment lies at the heart of the Christian gospel. When we proclaim the gospel, the response we're looking for, the response we're hoping for, the response we're praying for is for non-Christians to say, "I want what you have." And that's what Paul is discussing in our passage today. Now, 2 Sundays ago, we saw the Apostle Paul tell the Corinthians how good their church is. So Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8 verse 7, he says they excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you. And when we looked at that, I also pointed out that we here at Elwood Anglican excel in most things too, right? On top of what the Corinthians do, we excel in teaching, in praise, in God, in welcoming, in fellowship, and in joy. Right? Can you think of a more joyous place to be on a Sunday morning? And the reason we're so welcoming as a church is because we don't want to keep this joy for ourselves. We want others to have what we're having, right? And can I say, we are getting better at this as a church. So I wouldn't say we're excelling in evangelism yet, but we have had a steady stream of non-Christians coming along to our church over the last 6 to 8 years, and many of them have stuck around. Praise the Lord. What Paul outlines in our passage today are some of the basics needed in order to be a church that excels in evangelism. And what he does this by outlining how he does his ministry. So you can see it in the sermon, in the NIV heading there, Paul's defense of his ministry. So we finished like a 2-week side quest, if you want to call it that, where Paul did some fundraising in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And now in chapter 10, he returns to the main theme of his letter. And the main theme of his letter is these false teachers who had come to Corinth and had started teaching what we believe was a works-based gospel. Given Paul talks about the new covenant ministry in 2 Corinthians 3, we believe these false teachers were old covenant teachers. They were Judaizers. They were saying you need to do things, you need to follow the Old Testament law in order to be authentic Christians. And they've been bad-mouthing Paul to the Corinthians, claiming this whole new covenant gospel, that's not the real gospel. Now, up until this point in the letter, Paul has simply been defending himself against their accusations. But in this passage, he goes on the attack. And he shows that these false teachers are inauthentic ministers of the gospel, and he does that by comparing his ministry with their ministry. And if we want to excel in evangelism like the Apostle Paul did, if we want others to come and enjoy what we enjoy here at Elwood Anglican, then this is where we need to start. 2 Corinthians 10. And I've got 3 points to help us unpack this passage today, as you can see on your sermon outline. So we're going to begin by looking at how Paul does his ministry. I've titled that The Approach of Christian Ministry, verses 1 to 5. We'll then see why Paul's approach is better than the false teachers, and I've titled that The Importance of Christian Ministry, verses 6 to 11. And we'll then conclude by seeing what these false teachers are doing wrong, which I've titled The Heart of Christian Ministry, verses 12 to 18. They do not have the heart of Christian ministry. So if we want to excel at evangelism like we excel at most other things here at Elwood Anglican, then please come with me as we look at the how, the why, and the what of Christian ministry. And our passage begins with these words. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold towards you when away, I beg that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. So Paul, he's dealing here with yet another attack from these false teachers, and they seem to have claimed that Paul acts all big and tough when he's away, when he's writing letters, but in person, he's nothing more than a pathetic little weak beta male. And Paul says, look, if I have to be bold in person, I will be bold in person. I'd just rather not. Right? What I prefer with you Corinthians is to do what I do with everyone, and that is to appeal to you, verse 1, in humility and gentleness. And it's not just any humility and gentleness, it's the humility and gentleness of Christ. Now, what he's saying here is Jesus does not force people to do anything. Sadly, the church has failed to realise this at various stages throughout church history, all right? You think of the Crusades, you think of the Spanish Inquisition, even pockets of the Reformation saw the church, mind you, forcing things like conversions, confessions of sin, or obedience on pains of torture or even death. But Paul says that's not how Christ operates. He doesn't want to force anything. Instead, he wants to win your heart. Have a look at verse 4. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. All right, so the weapons that Paul fights with, they're not the sword or the spear. They're not to demand compliance on pains of death. They are the kind of weapons that can soften a person's heart. That's the stronghold that he's talking about there, the human heart. What Jesus wants is for people to fall in love with him. And if you know nothing else about how to do evangelism, this is what you need to know. Authentic Christian ministry does not bash people over the head with the Bible. We do not force people to convert. Our approach is to show people how amazing Jesus is so that they will fall in love with him. And Paul has 3 weapons. He gives us 3 weapons in which to do this with. So we see this in verse 5, the very next verse. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. All right, 3 weapons here. So to begin with, we demolish arguments. Friends, there is a myriad of arguments out there as to why people should not, or at least don't need, to follow Jesus. All right, what are those arguments? The Bible is pro-slavery. The Bible is anti-gay. The Bible hasn't science disproven God. Hasn't the church started too many wars? What about dinosaurs? What about suffering? Christianity is going to take all my faith, my fun away. What about those who have never heard of Jesus? The list goes on and on. And I'm not going to stand here and say that they are bad arguments. They're not. A lot of them are very good arguments. But what I will say is the Bible is not afraid of any of them. Our job as Christians is to, remember this, humbly and gently, verse 1, answer each of those arguments when they come up, when people bring them up to us. Now, here's how I would do it. Right? Unless you are a full-time Christian apologist, we're not going to know all the answers off the top of our heads. I don't know all the answers off the top of my head. Right? That's not my job. So what we do is, if someone makes one of those arguments towards us, what we do is we say, look, that's a really good point. Let me go and look into that for you, and I'll get back to you. And then you either come and talk to your minister and ask me, see if I've got the answer, or I can show you where to go. Another idea is there's a whole bunch of books out there on, hot potatoes for Christians. You can grab one of these books, or just get on YouTube. And there are countless videos out there of good Christian apologists answering all these questions. And then you go back to them and you say, hey, look, I've looked into this for you. Here's the answer. It actually gives you 2 bites of the cherry with that person. But the first step to calling people to come and enjoy what we enjoy is to figure out how to knock down all those arguments that people use as barriers to the gospel. Weapon number 2 is we demolish pretensions. Now, what are pretensions? Well, if you look up pretensions in the thesaurus, you get words like claims or assertions. But they're not just any old claims, because to be pretentious, it means you're setting yourself up above others, isn't it? And so pretensions are the kinds of arguments, the kinds of assertions in which people claim things like, oh, look, God isn't real. They're happy to say God isn't real, or God is not important. And in the end, this is what really stops people from coming to the Lord, right? People will always have arguments against Christianity. They'll always have something that they're using to say, oh, here's my excuse as to why I don't need to listen to the Bible, why I don't need to follow Jesus. But even as we knock all those arguments down, we're still left with the deep claims of their heart. And the way we deal with the deep claims of their heart is to show them with humility and gentleness, verse 1, that their assumptions about life, the universe, and everything are inferior to the Bible's. Right, so let me just give you one example. One of the popular pretensions today is that you cannot prove that God exists. That's one of these deep thoughts of people's hearts. And guess what? That's true. You can't. But neither can they prove that God doesn't exist. Right? Just because you can't see God doesn't mean he's not hiding out beyond Jupiter. The problem is those people are betting their eternity on that unprovable assumption. Now, our assumptions as Christians are based on hard, objective, propositional truths which atheists have to do business with if they're going to reject Christianity with integrity. All right, we need to be able to demolish those pretensions as well. The third weapon Paul mentions is a good Christian witness, right at the end of verse 5. And we take every thought captive, we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. What he means is Christians don't just keep our words and our deeds under control, we even keep our thoughts under control. We don't let our greedy thoughts or our envious thoughts or our lustful thoughts run riot in our minds. We show that Christ is so important to us that we even make our thoughts obedient to him. We are a good Christian witness. So, that's how Paul approaches his ministry. Now remember, Paul's job was an evangelist, right? So this is Christian evangelism, it's outreach. He appeals to people's hearts humbly and gently. Paul then makes what seems to be a very clunky gear change in verse 6. Read it with me. So he just said we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. Verse 6, and we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. In the words of Ron Burgundy, that escalated quickly. He's just gone from make every thought obedient to Christ to, and we're going to punish all the disobedience. All right, what's going on here? Well, we're going to see this answer play out over the next couple of weeks. He talks about this all through chapter 11 and 12 as well. But what Paul is concerned about here is if the Corinthians side with the false teachers, if the Corinthians are persuaded that what the false teachers are saying is correct, then they are headed for disaster. And it's not just disaster in this life, it's disaster in the next as well, right? This life and the next. Now, the reason they're headed for disaster in this life is because to reject the Apostle Paul means to reject close to half of the New Testament. Right? Paul wrote 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. That's almost half. And the thing you need to understand about the Bible is it is God's handbook on life. Right? You see, God is the author of the entire universe. He is the author of people, of marriage, of parenting, of work, of sex, of money, of church, of the arts, you name it. And he says, here is my handbook for how all these things are to be used. And when we go against how God's things are to be used, really bad things happen. But even worse is you're going against the heart of the Christian gospel, which follows us into the next life. Now, we're going to come back to that in point 3, the heart of the Christian gospel. But the reason Paul is getting a little stern in verses 6 to 11 is because of what is at stake here, right? If you set yourself up against the Apostle Paul, you're setting yourself up against the man God himself chose on the Damascus road to take the gospel to the Gentile. It is that important. Now, he's not getting stern with all the Corinthians here, right? He says in verse 6, he expects your obedience will be complete, all right? That's verse 6. If the false teachers, it's the false teachers Paul has in his crosshairs here, all right? Now, he says, watch out. These false teachers have been claiming that Paul's bark is worse than his bite. We see that in verse 10 over the page. What do they say? For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. And Paul is saying, look, don't mistake kindness for weakness. Don't mistake kindness for weakness. Verse 11, such people should realize that what we are in our letters, when we're absent, we will be in our actions when we are present, right? When Paul arrives back in Corinth, he is going to take these false teachers to task with the full force of his authority as God's chosen apostle to the Gentiles. Why? Because how we conduct ourselves in Christian ministry is very important. Right, so may we at Irwood Anglican continue to watch our life and our doctrine closely, because what is at stake here are people's lives and afterlives. So that's why Paul is so weighty and forceful in verses 6 to 11. Christian ministry is serious stuff. He then rounds out this passage by getting to the heart of where these false teachers have gone wrong. And it has to do with boasting. Have a look at verse 12. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves to themselves, they are not wise. So these false teachers are commending themselves to the Corinthians. All right? They're saying to the Corinthians, hey, we're the ones that you should be listening to, not this Paul. And the reasons they're given, and we need to pick this up from other parts of the letter, right? But the reasons they're giving are things like, look, we don't suffer hardships like Paul does. There's obviously something wrong with Paul's ministry because he keeps suffering. Chapter 1, we're well-educated, very well-educated men. We're great preachers, right? Very dynamic preachers, and we're really successful. Just look at us. And Paul says in verse 12, isn't it amazing that the characteristics they think are important for Christian ministry just so happen to be the exact characteristics that they have? They're measuring themselves by themselves. Californian preacher R. Kent Hughes says these false teachers are kind of like Hollywood today. Right? He says Hollywood is this little bubble where everyone there believes the same thing. And their groupthink leads them to think that they are not only the center of the universe, but that everyone else does, or at least should, believe what they believe, have the same values and ethics that they have. And every year, all of Hollywood gets together for their award shows because they're desperate to be validated. That's what the false teachers are like. They think everyone should be like them. They've got this little groupthink and they want to be validated. Now, here's the question. Why are they like that? Why are they so desperate to lay out what they think makes a good Christian minister and then boast about how they meet that criteria? Well, it's because that's how the religious mindset works. Now, I'm using the word religious there in the pejorative. It's an insult. All right? You see, the religious mindset says if you work really hard and you study your Bible and you go to church and you follow the 10 Commandments, then God will have to let you into heaven. He owes you heaven. The Christian gospel that Paul preaches is completely different to that. Right? The Christian gospel says you cannot actually prove yourself. Whether it be through being a good moral person or a successful preacher, because you know deep in your heart that you cannot actually do the things you ought to do. Right? If you ask a good religious person whether they're going to make it to heaven or not, they will say, I hope so. Right? Even the best Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox Christians have a huge doubt in their heart because they know they have not done the things they ought to be doing. And this is why Jesus says the prostitutes and the publicans are getting into the kingdom of heaven ahead of the Pharisees and the religious teachers, the religious leaders. It's because if you go to the pimps and the drug addicts and the porn stars and the ex-cons and you say to them, look, you are a slave to your desires. You're a spiritual failure and you need an experience of God's supernatural grace in your life. If you say to those kinds of people, they are very likely going to say, you know what, maybe you're right. But if you go to a religious person, a spiritual high achiever, if you go to a morally upright person, a person who loves religion, and you say you're a slave to your self-righteousness and your desires, you are a spiritual failure and you need an experience of God's supernatural grace, they're likely to look at you and say, how dare you? I go to church every week, thank you very much. And I had to work hard to be a good, upstanding moral person. Right? The reason it is so hard to preach the gospel in the rich areas of Sydney, the reason Christianity is waning in the West but exploding in the global South, is because salvation by works makes sense to successful people. And the gospel doesn't. Right? It makes sense, the works gospel makes sense to those who are measuring themselves by themselves. The Christian gospel, however, is compelling to those who know their inadequacies. And this is why Paul says, I'm going to be very careful in how I boast. Right? I'm not going to boast like these spiritual elites are boasting. He says, look, I'll boast about where I preach the gospel. Have a look at verse 14. We are not going too far in our boasting, as we would be the case if we had not come to you, for we did get as far as you with the Christian gospel. The Corinthians heard the gospel first from Paul. We learn that from Acts chapter 18. So Paul says, look, I'm happy to say that I preached the gospel to you. That's about as far as I'm going to go with my boasting. I'm not going to say that I preached the gospel in areas that I haven't been to yet, like Spain or Italy. That's what verse 15 is getting at, right? So that's what Paul's boast is. Look, I preached the gospel here. I haven't preached the gospel there. But here's the rub. And this is the heart of the Christian ministry. Even though Paul preached the gospel to the Corinthians, he doesn't point to it as some good work that's going to get him to heaven. What does he say? It's a famous verse. Verse 17. But let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Friends, the Christian gospel says you cannot save yourself, whether you're the Pope or Mother Teresa or Billy Graham or even the guy who wrote half the New Testament. The things, you cannot actually do the things you know deep down you should be doing. You need the supernatural gift of grace of Jesus dying on the cross for your sins. But this is our topic for today. We also need God's grace in Christian ministry, in outreach. Right? If we want others to enjoy what we enjoy here at Irwood Anglican, we need God's grace. Right? Even though Paul preached the gospel to the Corinthians, Paul knew it wasn't him who converted them. It was God. So here's our application for today as we close. All right, got two things. Number one, when we are out there demolishing arguments and demolishing pretensions and being a good Christian witness, very humbly and gently, all right, don't ever look down on non-Christians. Don't ever think we're a better person from them. That's not the humility and gentleness of Christ. right? When we appeal to non-Christians by showing them how amazing Jesus is, we are to do it with humility, but also a divine level of hope for their soul. Right? Do not ever think, well, they're not the Christian type. Because here's the thing. Before you got that supernatural grace in your life, neither were you. Second thing. Though we have some runs on the board here at Elwood Anglican at the moment, I said this 2 weeks ago, I've lost count of how many people have said nice things about our church of late. It's been really nice. May we not use that as an opportunity to pat ourselves on the back. May we rather use it as an opportunity to praise God for what he's doing here. Because everything good about this place is a free and undeserved gift from God. So, brothers and sisters, we live in a world where people set incredibly low standards for themselves and then compare themselves to those incredibly low standards and then congratulate themselves that they have met those incredibly low standards. In a world like that, may we at Elwood Anglican instead say, I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection.